The first siren cut across the rooftops while Thomas Varga was still warming his fingers on the keys of his teacher's upright. He froze with his right hand suspended above an A minor chord he had been polishing for 3 weeks. The note he meant to play was the opening of his debut concerto. The note he heard instead was the long, climbing wail of a city being told to be afraid. "Keep going," Professor Harler said from the doorway, but his face had gone the color of old paper. 3 weeks until the hall, Thomas. They cannot stop time for sirens." Thomas was 22. He had practiced for this debut since he was 9. He let his hand fall and the chord rang, but the sustain swallowed itself in the second siren, then a third, and then the wet, faraway thump of something heavy landing on the river district. The piano stool trembled under him as if the building had remembered an old fear. By dusk, the streets were a different country. Soldiers in unfamiliar grey directed traffic with rifles. Posters bloomed overnight, ordering people to register, surrender, wirelesses, obey. A truck rolled past with someone's grandmother on a pile of suitcases. She was not crying. Nobody on that truck was crying, yet none of them had decided what was happening. The next morning, Haller locked the practice room door and pulled the curtains. "The debut is cancelled. The hall is requisitioned." He laid his hands on the lid as if to keep it from leaving. "Your name is on a list. You must not go home." Thomas heard himself ask about his mother. Haller's face answered before his mouth did. That night, Thomas slept under a tarp in the storeroom of a stage carpenter who had once built a riser for one of his recitals. The carpenter gave him a half loaf of black bread and a coat too large for him, and said only, "Don't play, don't whistle, don't hum." Then he went out and did not come back. For 3 weeks, Thomas moved through the city the way a moth moves through a curtain, flatly, sideways, toward the small holes where the light wasn't. He slept above a bakery, behind a printing press, in a confessional, in a closed church. He learned to walk without rhythm, because rhythm was the thing the soldiers were trained to notice. His left hand still shaped chords against his thigh at intersections. He caught himself doing it in a queue for water and made himself stop. Then, the third week, broke open in a way that put him underground. A neighbor of the bakery family had been questioned. The bakery family was packing in the dark. The wife pressed an iron key into Tomas's hand and said, "Number 12, Kovac Street. Cellar, knock 4. He owes us. Go now." He went on foot, the long way, through gardens behind houses, and arrived after curfew. Number 12 was a tall, narrow building with iron grills on the windows and a courtyard that smelled of coal. He found the cellar door behind a stack of split wood, fitted the key with hands no longer his own, and slipped inside. 2 flights of stone steps. A lantern at the bottom. At the lantern sat a man in a railway coat, a rifle across his knees that had not been cleaned in a long time. "Sit," the old watchman said. "I will not ask your name." He was Mr. Komar, a night watchman of 40 years before the customs yards closed. A widower with a daughter in a village whose name he would not say out loud, who slept in the cellar because the upstairs tenants paid him in soup, and who had, without telling anyone, begun hiding people. He set Thomas behind a wall of stacked crates and gave him a folded grey blanket and a cup of water. "You will be quiet. You will not cough. You will not light anything. When the patrols come, you will breathe through your sleeve. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded. He was already trembling. "What is it you do, son?" Thomas hesitated. He had been told for 3 weeks not to be what he was. "I am a pianist." Mr. Komar studied him for a long moment. The lantern caught the deep lines in his face. "Good," he said at last. "Then you have something to do here." He hooked the lantern over his arm and led Thomas around the crates to the far end of the cellar. There, under stiff brown sailcloth, was a piano. An old upright, the wood scarred, 2 candle cup ornaments missing, 1 front caster replaced with a chunk of brick. The keys were the colour of weak tea, some ivories chipped, and a black key in the middle octave had been replaced with a sliver of dark wood polished by someone's thumb. "It does not make sound," Mr. Komar said calmly. "I took the hammers off. The dampers do not betray a man. You will sit. You will play. Your fingers will go through everything you know. The piano will say nothing, and the room will say nothing, and your hands will say everything." Thomas stared at the silent keys. What is the point of a piano that does not play? The old watchman set the lantern on a shelf, sat on an upturned crate, and folded his thick hands between his knees. "My boy," he said at last, "if you can still play, you can still live. Sit down." Thomas sat. He laid his fingers on the keys, and at the first touch a long shudder went through him that had been waiting 3 weeks for permission to arrive. His hands had been told for so many days to be still that they had forgotten how to be skilled. He closed his eyes and began, very slowly, the opening of the concerto he was to have debuted. The keys went down. The pads of his fingers met the worn surface of each, the cool slick of the long ivories, the small ridge of the chipped E, the smooth wooden sliver where the original key had been. The hammers, removed, did not strike. No sound came out of the soundboard, but under his fingers Thomas felt the ribs of the piano the way a man feels the ribs of a horse he has ridden for years, the give of the action, the whisper of the felts, the wooden tick when a pedal lifted. His foot found the pedal, though there was nothing for the pedal to sustain. The right, then the left, then the right again on the downbeat of an answering phrase. He played the opening pages, the bridge, then the place where the orchestra would have entered, and in the cellar he heard it, not with his ears but somewhere behind his eyes, the long sustained breath of strings he had memorized note by note. He played his part against it as if the hall existed and the conductor was lifting his baton and his mother was in the third row in her grey dress. Mr. Komar watched. Once he reached up, slowly, and turned the lantern down a half shade, as if even the light might make a sound. When Tomas finished long after curfew, his shirt wet at the shoulders, he lifted his hands and discovered he was weeping. So was the old watchman. They did not speak about it. Mr. Komar put a thin slice of black bread on top of the piano and went back to his rifle. This is how Tomas Varga survived a winter. He learned the cellar the way he had once learned scales. The third stone from the door was loose and could hide a heel of bread. Mr. Komar's rifle had no firing pin. He had buried it in a flower pot the week the soldiers came. The rifle was for show. The patrols had bootfuls. The young pair came at 10:20 and laughed at their own jokes. The older sergeant came at 3 in the morning alone and did not laugh at anything. The older sergeant was the one to fear. He came to the silent piano every night the patrols allowed. Sometimes he played 10 minutes before Mr. Komar tapped the floor twice and he folded himself behind the crates and stopped breathing. Sometimes he played for hours by memory. He played the concerto until he no longer needed it. He played Bach because Bach is what a man plays when he wants to remember how a thing is built. He played a Schubert impromptu for the bakery family, who had not arrived where they were going. He played a small, unfinished waltz his mother had made up at the kitchen table when he was 6, and the playing of it was the closest he could get to telling her he had not forgotten her. One night nearly ended him. The older sergeant came down an hour early. Mr. Komar's 2 boot taps came too late. Thomas froze on a B-flat chord, breathing through his sleeve. The sergeant's boots crossed the floor above toward the wall of crates. Thomas counted to 20 before he heard Mr. Komar say, calmly, that there was nothing back there but his old wife's sewing machine, and would the sergeant care for a cup of something hot before continuing his rounds. The sergeant said nothing for a long time. Then he laughed, once, without humour, and accepted. He had been spared by a man with no rifle and a kettle of weak tea. Twice more the soldiers came down. Both times Mr. Komar met them at the foot of the stairs with the empty rifle across his arm, and they left without checking behind the crates. The second time, Thomas understood from a small movement of the old man's eyes that they had left because Mr. Komar had given them something. He did not ask what. He understood later when there was less bread. Hunger taught him things the conservatory had not. A man who has not eaten for 2 days plays slower and hears more. The right pedal in silence made a faint felt-on-felt whisper he could fit between his heartbeats. His left hand could carry a melody alone when the right had become too cold to feel the keys. The chipped E had a tiny burr he could find without looking, and he came to love it the way a sailor loves a landmark. One February evening, the small boy from the apartment above came down with his mother to bring Mr. Komar a bowl of beet soup. The boy was 8, with eyes too large for his face. He stood in the lantern light staring at Tomas's hands on the silent keys. Tomas slid sideways and patted the wood beside him. The boy climbed up. Tomas put the boy's small finger on the chipped E and pressed it down with him, and showed him how the note that did not sound was still a note, because a note was a thing you decided to make, not a thing the world decided to let you have. By the end of February, the boy could play a one-handed Bach minuet on a piano that made no sound at all. There were others. A woman with half her face cut and a baby against her shoulder who stayed 8 days and on the 4th night said her husband had played Mozart, and Thomas gave her a Mozart andante in a piano that made no sound, and she rocked the baby and did not, that night, weep. A railway clerk, a school teacher, each received a silent piece. The chipped E became, for Tomas, a different note depending on who had last sat beside him. He learned, in those months, that there are 2 kinds of silence. The silence the soldiers want is the silence of a thing afraid to be alive. The silence inside a piano whose hammers have been taken off is the silence of a thing waiting. The first kills a man slowly, the second keeps him. Spring came in stages, a thaw, a refreeze, a thaw. Then one morning, the city was full of new uniforms again, but these were the uniforms of soldiers liberating things instead of taking them. The curfew lifted, and people stood blinking on the street the way creatures come out of a long burrow. Thomas climbed the stone steps for the first time in months, and the daylight nearly knocked him down. Mr. Komar walked him to the corner. The old watchman had become smaller in the cellar. His coat hung from him like a sheet on a line. He held out his hand, and Thomas took it. "You will find a hall again," Mr. Komar said. "Sooner than you think. Come with me." The old man shook his head. "I am a cellar man. The cellar is what I know." He paused. "When you stand in a hall again, play one piece for the people who could not. Not a sad one, a good one." Thomas could not speak. He nodded. The old watchman pressed something into his palm. The small wooden sliver from the upright's missing black key eased out for him to keep. It was warm from the old man's coat pocket. 3 months later, the conservatory hall, scarred but standing, opened its doors again. The old concerto could not be revived. The orchestra was hollowed of half its players. So Thomas walked out alone onto a stage that smelled of fresh plaster and sat at a piano whose lacquer caught the lights like still water. The seats were full strangers, soldiers in convalescent blue, a widow with a small boy beside her. The conductor he was to have played with stood at the back of the hall, alive, thinner, watching. Thomas placed his hands on the keys. For a long moment, he did not move. In his left pocket, he could feel the small, smooth weight of Mr. Komar's wooden sliver. He felt under his fingertips the chipped enamels of 100 upright cellars, the silent ribs of a piano that had taught him everything. He thought of the old watchman's voice in lantern light. If you can still play, you can still live. He chose the small, unfinished waltz his mother had made up at the kitchen table. Then he played, and the hammers struck, and the sound that came out of the soundboard was such a clean, clear thing after the silence of the cellar that for the first 3 bars Thomas did not believe it was his. The waltz climbed in his right hand. His left walked under it in steady 3 counts, the way she used to do. The room soldiers, widow, small boy, conductor, leaned forward together as if pulled on the same string. A man in the second row pressed a handkerchief to his mouth. Somewhere in the dark a chair creaked once and was still. The waltz was not finished, because she had not finished it. So Thomas finished it for her, there, in front of strangers, slowly and without showing off, with one long-held chord at the end that he sustained until it died into the rafters all by itself. The silence afterward was the longest he had ever heard. Then the small boy in the third row put his hands together, once, and the hall erupted in a sound so warm and so full that Thomas had to bend his head over the keys to keep his face in order. He played one more piece, for Mr. Komar, who could not be there because the old watchman had died quietly in the cellar of number 12 in the last week of winter, sitting up with his rifle across his knees before the new uniforms came. The widow upstairs had told Thomas that morning. He played a Chopin nocturne, not a sad one, a good one, the way the old man had asked. He played it for the bakery family, the carpenter, his mother in her grey dress, the small boy with the silent minuet, the woman with the baby, and the older sergeant who had walked away with a cup of weak tea. He played it slowly enough that nobody could mistake it for a flourish, and quickly enough that nobody could mistake it for grief. When the last note went up into the lights, Thomas Varga lifted his hands and understood, finally, what the old watchman had meant. The piano had never been about being heard. It had been about staying a person while the world tried to make him into something else. The music had not survived the city. He had survived the city because of the music. The two were not the same thing, and a man who confused them would never play a real note again. He laid his right hand flat on the closed lid, the way Haller had done the morning the siren started, as if to keep it from leaving. In his pocket, the wooden sliver was still warm. An unfinished thing was not the same as a broken one. A waltz his mother had not finished could be finished by a son. A winter the old watchman had not survived could be carried forward by the boy who had. That was the only way a city like theirs ever truly rose again. Not in monuments, in hands that remembered. He stood and bowed to the hall and more carefully to the empty seats. The hall stood. Thomas stood. And somewhere, he knew, in a cellar that smelled of coal and lantern oil, a silent upright with a wooden sliver where a black key had been was still listening.